Hello, everybody, and our apologies for the slight delay there. We just had a few last-minute tech issues. I'm sorry about that delay. But welcome to the third and the final webinar in our Season on Springs series. Over the past two sessions, we've spoken with 7 brilliant individuals who have taught us about the critical importance of springs and given a fantastic insight into spring biodiversity and the research that has occurred into these marvelous ecosystems. You can head over to Shoal's YouTube channel to watch both of these sessions. And today we're going to hear from hopefully 4 experts, but at the moment it's looking like it may be 3 who will focus on spring conservation and policy. I've just seen that there's another John Simaika who's joining us. I'm hoping that that's Sanot, but we don't yet
Yeah.
know. We think it is.
Hi. Hi
Hi,
everyone. Sorry
Sanot.
for delaying to join me.
No
I
worries.
was yeah, waiting for another chat room. Yes. So sorry for it, and thanks, John, for connecting me.
We had a last minute panic getting Sanat on, but wonderful that it happened at the late juncture. Better late than never. Sanat, are you able to get your video on? Are you able to turn your camera on?
Okay. Sorry. Stop. Uh, okay, I'm trying it. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, brilliant that Sanat can make it. And first up, we will have John Simaika, who's based in Sri Lanka, though he's currently in South Africa. And John is a senior researcher at the International Water Management Institute. He specializes in the biological monitoring and assessment of rivers with a particular focus on freshwater biodiversity, biomonitoring, and ecosystem integrity across African river basins. His work integrates aquatic and landscape ecology with applied conservation science, generating robust policy relevant evidence to support sustainable water management and restoration. With over a decade of research engagement in Africa, John has led and contributed to studies across diverse freshwater systems, addressing key pressures on water quality and ecological integrity. He led the development of a new freshwater biomonitoring index for South Africa, recognized with the Marsh Award for Early Career Research in Entomology in 2017, and has coordinated interdisciplinary research on the impacts of alien vegetation on streams. John is the founder and co-chair of the Biodiversity and Biological Monitoring and Assessment, BBMA, workstream of the World Water Quality Alliance and the IUCN SSC Task Force on Global Freshwater Macroinvertebrate Protocols. The aim of these initiatives is to harmonize biological monitoring at both the technical and the policy framework level. From 2017 to 2025, John works at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education, combining research, teaching, and international collaboration in aquatic ecology and conservation. He has authored 50 peer-reviewed articles, 5 book chapters, and 3 books, and serves as handling editor for conservation biology. Next, we'll hear from Nelida Barajas Acosta. Nelida is the executive director at CEDO, the Centro Intercultural de Estudios de Desiertos y Océanos, or the Intercultural Center for the Study of Deserts and Oceans, based in Mexico. She is a conservation biologist, science policy interface specialist, and a dedicated advocate for freshwater ecosystems. She leads the binational effort to protect endangered species in the Sanot River and the Sonoran Desert. Her work bridges science and community to ensure the survival of unique desert aquatic life. Following Nelida will be Sanot Adhikari, the CEO of the Alliance for Environment and the chairperson for the Youth Alliance for Environment in Nepal. Sanot holds a master's degree in environmental science and brings over 18 years of experience in climate change, environmental sustainability, and water sources conservation, with a particular focus on mountain springs. He has been deeply engaged in environmental policy and planning, contributing to various national policy and plan formulation processes in Nepal. His research on spring sources as the lifeline of mountain communities has been widely recognized with dozens of publications in international peer-reviewed journals. He has extensive expertise in adaptation planning, climate finance, and environmental governance, working across local to global scales. He actively advocates for environmental issues, and since 2010, he has consistently followed the global climate negotiation UNFCCC COP process through both in-person and virtual participation. Closing off the presentations will be Joseph Holway, the incoming director at the Spring Stewardship Institute, based out in Arizona, USA. Joseph's based in Colorado, and he leads efforts to advance the scientific understanding and global stewardship of spring ecosystems. He earned his PhD in Environmental Life Sciences from Arizona State University in 2024 and was a 2021 Fulbright Research Scholar in Cambodia, studying the nexus of hydrologic variability, biodiversity, and food security in the Lower Mekong Basin. Born and raised in the Southwest US, he combines a passion for springs with expertise in spring ecology, field research, data analysis, and community engagement. Joseph has recently written a guest post for the Shoal blog titled The Forgotten Front Lines of Freshwater Conservation, Why Springs Are the Quiet Center of the Freshwater World, which gives a really fantastic insight into springs' fundamental importance and how, despite this, they have historically been almost invisible to the global conservation conversation. If you've not read it, I urge you to go take a look. Just before we get started, very tiny bit of housekeeping. I've already done far too much talking. Today's webinar will last approximately an hour and a half, potentially up to 2 hours. After John, Sanot, Nelida, and Joseph have presented, we'll hold a question and answer session. So please do keep your questions coming in throughout the chat. Also, feel free to introduce yourself and say where in the world you're joining us from. It's always so fun to see the geographic spread of these sessions. We often have people joining from right around the world. The session is being recorded, and as always, we will upload it to YouTube before the weekend. John, Sanot, Nelida, and Joseph, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to speak with you and learn about the policy and conservation that is planned or in place for springs. That's absolutely it from me for a while. John, are you ready to pull up your presentation?
I am. Thanks so much, Michael, for the introduction. Then I guess my question is, can you see my notes? I mean, can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good. Well, it's my great pleasure then to talk a little bit about how springs fare in policy agendas. It is a fairly enormous topic. And as such, this is really just a very brief journey into into why freshwater springs matter for policy agendas. So springs are significant but really overlooked ecosystems. Springs provide drinking water for hundreds of millions of people, especially in mountain and in karst regions. Agricultural irrigation from spring-fed systems support millions of small farms in Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. The bottled water market is worth between $270 to $350 billion annually, of which the mineral spring water segment is the largest. There's also thermal and mineral spring tourism, which is valued between $56 and $64 billion annually, and these are the pre-COVID numbers. In terms of biodiversity, springs host unique, often endemic species adapted to stable temperatures and chemistry. And many, as a consequence, are of course globally restricted. Like most other ecosystems, springs too face many different threats. Among these are groundwater extraction, which then lowers the water tables and threatens to dry out springs. Pollution from agriculture, mining, and sewage contaminating recharge zones. Land use change and deforestation, reducing infiltration and recharge. Infrastructure development, such as roads, resorts, and dams, damage spring outlets. Climate change is altering recharge patterns and increasing drought frequency. And of course, the theme of this particular presentation is also the neglect of springs in policy and in terms of being monitored. Springs are rarely recognized in national or biodiversity legislation. Finally, there is tourism mismanagement, leading to trampling, contamination, and habitat loss. So a brief example, which I borrowed from Joseph. Thank you, Joseph, for the slide. Is the Del Rio Springs in Arizona, which was once the main headwater of the Verde River, and has experienced a sharp decline in flow, now producing only about 1/10 of historical discharge. The drop is primarily due to groundwater overpumping from the Little Chino aquifer to supply growing municipal water and industrial demand in nearby communities. As groundwater levels have fallen, base flow to the Verde River has diminished, drying sections of the river and degrading riparian ecosystems. So if this then continues, of course, the springs are projected to cease flowing entirely, threatening both local water security and biodiversity. So in terms of where are we now, from a global perspective, there is rising political awareness and momentum towards recognizing the hydrological cycle as a global common good. The hydrological system is a planetary system and thus globally interconnected. Changes in precipitation and evaporation in one region will thus affect another. From a global policy perspective, freshwater springs are an essential piece to achieving Target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework on conserving 30% of terrestrial inland water and coastal and marine areas, including through other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs for short. And if restored, they would then also contribute to Target 2 on restoring 30% of degraded ecosystems. Right. So springs also support, of course, or springs restoration supports sustainable development. And there are several SDGs that are supported. These are 6, 15, 11, and 13. So protecting and restoring springs also advances the SDGs. This includes 6 on clean water and sanitation, with cross linkages to 11 on sustainable cities and communities, and 13 on action on climate action, and SDG 15 on life on land. So under the SDGs indicator 6.6.1 on measuring the change in the extent of water-related ecosystems over time, and 6.B.1 on measuring community participation in water management, including springshed management are relevant. The proportion of important sites for terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity that are covered by protected areas is an essential measure of the protected area coverage of spring habitats. For example, key biodiversity areas. As this indicator is the indicator on average proportion of mountain key biodiversity areas covered by protected areas. In terms of then climate action and cities, we're looking at tracking the number of countries that have taken steps to enhance their climate resilience, the integration of springshed protection and restoration into national adaptation plans feeds into this indicator. The latter indicator, so this is 11, tracks the total spending on the preservation, protection, and conservation of cultural and natural heritage per year per capita, and is therefore then, of course, of relevance to tracking sacred or heritage springs. So then, why are springs often invisible in policy? And here I give 7 reasons. There are probably more, and of course they're, let's say they're important, so their priority varies. But the listing, of course, does not indicate, which is more important than the other. So from a national perspective, springs can, depending on the focus, be embedded in any of 6 national guidances. This includes, these are the guidances. This includes policy on water resources and allocation, including legal aspects regarding water quantity and access. Then environmental protections and water quality, thus being covered by legislation on pollution, biodiversity, and nature conservation, land use planning and natural resource management, climate change adaptation and water security, including disaster risk management, And finally, policies on cultural heritage and the traditional use of springs. Okay, so then moving on to why are springs often invisible in policy? So the first one here being absence of springs from national data systems. Few countries systematically map springs or monitor spring discharge quality or ecological condition, limiting restoration opportunities and planning for climate adaptation and disaster risk management. There's also fragmented governance. So mandates are typically fragmented across groundwater, surface water, land, and biodiversity institutions. Governance is fragmented, then creating regulatory gaps and risks to spring ecosystems. There's inadequate climate resilience planning, rising climate and hydrological uncertainty, such as intensification of droughts, erratic recharge, and land degradation, heighten the risk of spring shed degradation or loss. Then perhaps a bit more abstract, but also important, is the absence from a geopark or geodiversity or World Heritage inventories. So the invisibility of springs in local and national inventories of sites of geological interest and traditional uses or knowledge of geodiversity. Then fifth, we have the exclusion in decision making. So there's a limited formal recognition of indigenous peoples and local communities and women as custodians of springs. So despite their knowledge of spring systems, indigenous people and local communities often lack formal roles in springshed governance. And then six, there's limited scientific capacity. Spring hydrology, ecology, and stewardship lack adequate research investment, specialist networks, and trained practitioners, particularly outside a small number of well-established research centers. And last is point 7 on the weak integration and planning and management. Springs rarely appear in river basin plans, environmental flow targets, disaster risk frameworks, or national adaptation plans. And of course, very often we'll see that if anyone talks about springs, it's mainly in the context of springs as a water resource, rather than from other perspectives like the importance of protecting springs for biodiversity. So that then gets me to looking at the gaps. So there's not enough time to go through all the gaps. So I only selected 2. The first one here is the absence from national data systems. So the action here then is to embed conservation objectives for springs and pools in national policies and strategies. The main instrument being the Kunming GBF. This requires parties to include conservation or restoration actions for inland waters in national biodiversity strategy and action plans. So we're going already from the global to the national. But the implementation part then is get springs into national action plans, which then would mean that springs have to be inventoried, that they have to be legally protected, and a kind of zoning then needs to happen or should happen under a legal protection. And of course, there are lots of global tools out there that can help in springshed prioritization or protection. Okay, so then here's a case study, the Kleffer Spring in Austria. And the reason I chose this is that this spring actually, or it's several springs. They are responsible for essentially feeding drinking water to Vienna. So Vienna is completely dependent on these springs. The Kleffer Spring is one of the biggest ones. And the interesting outcome here is that you have both spring protection, but at the same time biodiversity protection. So a little bit more about the spring. It's a major karst spring in the Salztal Valley in Austria, located on the northern slopes of the Hochschwab Massif, and it is one of the most important drinking water sources indeed in Central Europe and forms part of Vienna's water supply system. The Clever Spring is one of Europe's richest drinking water springs. It rises at a distance of 14 kilometers from Wild Alpen in the Syrian Salza Valley on the northern slope of the Hochschwab Massif. In the winter months, the yield of the spring is small, but in spring, with the thawing of the snow, 10,000 liters of water per second gush from the mountain, equaling 860 million liters per day. So the spring source itself it emerges within a protected mountain environment and is not freely accessible because of its importance to the public water supply. The water protection zone around the Brunngraben, Höllbach, Siebensee, and Schreerklamm and Clever Springs is monitored by the management of the Wildalpen plant. And here you have in the bottom left a picture of then what it looks like inside the mountain, and of course the top is a picture of the Clever Spring, an area of the Clever Spring. Oops. Yeah. Then the next example. Yeah, so this is then the next gap is unlimited scientific capacity. So here the action would be to support spring specialists, their scientific and technical work. We have again the same instrument, and this then includes capacity building and technical and scientific cooperation mechanisms. So the network of regional support centers, capacity targets, such as targets 20 and 21. So these are then implementing pathways for funding or support of specialists working on springs. And would include support from IUCN, Ramsar, and CBD technical networks. So the second case study then is from the Canton Aargau Spring Inventory Program in Switzerland. So the Aargau, or the Canton, is, if you like, is a province or a state, and they were quite concerned some years ago that their springs were disappearing, that they were degrading. They actually had no idea of what they have available. And so what the Canton did, they asked an NGO and 3 other organizations to help them map springs. And so this NGO called Pro Natura Aargau actually employed 150 volunteers to do this inventory over 4 years. And they received training to understand how they can, well, what makes a spring, so how to identify a spring. And they worked at 7,600 locations across the canton, checking and mapping and photographing source sites. The collected data is now part forms the basis of the protection and promotion of spring habitats for the assessment of construction projects and for education and research. And there are some interesting results from the mapping itself. The inventory has produced extensive, but also some questionable results. Only 10% of the springs are still in their natural state, and 10% are impaired. 77% have been captured or have disappeared. So, however, since numerous spring catchments are not known, the proportion of natural, the proportion of natural springs can be estimated to be much smaller. The spring researcher Jens Zollhofer estimated a residual stock of 1% of natural springs. So that's quite significant. There would be only 76 springs out of the 7,600 that were surveyed that are still considered natural. The natural and impaired spring habitats are mostly located in the forest, so that's 82%. And the open countryside, they have become very rare or have practically disappeared from settlements. But this is quite significant and shows actually the power of using volunteers, capacitating volunteers to then also close gaps in inventory and mapping, which is a good solution to go forward with. Right. So maybe just in terms of a little bit more information on the actions. So the inventory and mapping happened. There was a classification of the springs and their ecological status. The actions included the protection of intact spring habitats as a result of the mapping. The degraded sites were restored, and well, there was monitoring of spring biodiversity, which I think was relatively, if you're used to tropical numbers, is relatively low, but still significant. Target species included spring snails, bryophytes, and aquatic macroinvertebrates. In terms of outcome, springs are now part of the planning and management. There is awareness of springs as biodiversity hotspots, and because this was the first time done in this particular canton, this actually now serves as a kind of model for other cantons. So in other words, provinces or states. And there is quite a strong policy link across Swiss policies as well. Not only in terms of looking at springs as a water resource, but also as a cultural resource and also a biodiversity resource. Okay, and with that, thank you very much. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them perhaps at the end of the presentations.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. I have a quick question actually. The points that you made about why springs are often invisible in policy, the fragmented governments, inadequate climate resilience framing, etc. To what extent are these, you highlighted 7 points, to what extent are they exclusive to springs, and how do we find ways around these policy visibility challenges? How do we put springs on the map?
That's a good question. So I think some years ago, not so long ago, freshwater ecosystems were completely invisible in global policies, and so it's actually a very recent phenomenon that freshwater ecosystems are included. Now, in terms of looking at freshwater ecosystems, I think that the main issue is that they're always regarded as resources first. So looking at them from a biodiversity perspective or a cultural heritage perspective, etc. Those are relatively new perspectives from a legal standpoint. And yeah, in terms of is it new that, or is fragmentation unique to springs or freshwaters? I would say no. It's not a unique phenomenon. So typically you have 3 or 4 ministries that align with particular legislation. They don't really communicate with each other because they're responsible for different aspects of something. So that's not new, but I think, or I'd like to think that when it comes to terrestrial ecosystems, that there's a lot more cooperation and alignment in legislation than there is in freshwater.
Great, thank you. And maybe some of the other speakers are going to touch on some of the challenges and ways to overcome them in their talks as well, perhaps. Nelida, you are next. Are you happy to pull your presentation up? Thanks, John. Oh, you're on mute, Nelida.
Thank you. Send request. Share. I cannot share. Can you please grant me to share?
You should be able to now, I think.
No. Oh, yes, now I can. Sorry. Okay, share. So let me know if you are watching my presentation or other thing.
Yeah, we can see the whole screen at the moment. The whole desk.
Can you see the native freshwater fish conservation? Yep. Okay. And now you can see in presentation mode.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. So good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Today we will travel to the Sonoran Desert borderlands, a trinational landscape or ecosystem shared between US and Mexico and the Tohono O'odham Nation. Probably you imagine the Sonoran Desert as an arid lands and wondering why we are talking about oasis when talking about the Sonoran Desert. But let me tell you that the Sonoran Desert is the most humid desert in the world, and where even under the extreme heat, the true ecological pulse is driven by water, especially the ancient interconnected desert springs, oases, and intermittent streams. My name is Nelida Barajas, and I'm the CEO of CEDO Intercultural, and really a borderlander and a long-term freshwater advocate, as Michael mentioned, without all the academic credentials. And as a note, please, when I've been talking, when I say border and recognizing that there are borders all around the world, that there are many people from different locations, when I say the border, I will mean to the Mexico-US border. But this border really implies three nations because we recognize the ancient territories of the Tohono O'odham Nation in the Sonoran Desert. So what we are working with, why the desert ecosystems in the borderlands are so important. So CEDO is member of a tricultural working group that advocate to protect two freshwater fish species in the Sonoran Desert, in the Sonoita River Basin. The Sonoita popfish, Cyprinodon eremus, and Sonoita longfin dace, Agosia chrysogaster. And recently, we joined forces with other specialists and institutions to amplify our work, and under the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, other environmental multilateral agreements, and the Mexican federal and subnational policies and frameworks, we are developing a strategy for the Northwest Mexico, Southwest US, Arizona, Sonora, Arizona, to strengthen the way that we are working. So let me, this is the shared waters we work with. So even when we are divided now by a wall, we really share streams, oases, and groundwater. But now let me retake the 26 years of a conservation story on the ephemeral Sonoita River watershed streams. The national protected areas, both sides of the border, we have protected areas, and of course, ancient territories. Here we have two oasis sisters, Quirobaquiro in Arizona and Quirobac in Mexico, co-starting the story. So when talking about that, we will talk about those stars that are the oasis and the species that used to live in them. So co-starting this story with the people and these two native species, we really want to highlight that the oases are not isolated each side of the border wall, but interlinked ecologically and culturally mirror and face day-to-day great challenges to survive. Water over allocation, infrastructure development, growing communities, climate change, altered water patterns, amongst other things. So to give you an example how big or how great are those challenges that we are facing, let me talk a little bit about the legal black hole we are living. And this is related because we're talking about policies to protect the oasis and the freshwater. And the American scar. So in other words, the border wall between Mexico and US. The sociopolitical landscape put biodiversity on a break. Under the Section 102 of a Real ID Act 2005, the United States enacted the largest waiver in federal law in its story to build the barrier, the wall. Over 40 core environmental and cultural heritage protection, included the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act, were violated. They built the border wall, and nowadays, in the meantime we're talking, they are building a second border wall in the wall. So it will be a border wall, and then a couple 100 meters, another wall. And that will affect directly Quito Springs. So from Quito, we are able on seeing this, and now the new border wall will, just be right there. So these activities create a black hole, stripping land managers and the regulatory tools. They are affecting the fragile desert hydrology complex. The result is what we call the American scar. The 653 miles of barrier and 354 miles of solid wall, that it is growing every day. So those data were like a month ago. I'm not sure that those are, the latest data to share. But please be aware that even when we are talking about the border wall in the US, this is not the only threat that these two big oases in the Sonoran Desert are facing. In Mexico, they are planning to build a pipeline to conduct fracking gas from Texas to Baja California, and it will be running just by the border wall. And that will affect as well the oasis, hydrology, and freshwater, and all the things we care about. So nature knows no borders, and borders are more like human constructions. Going back to the wall, many of us claim that as the biggest it is a historical mistake. It is the second largest constructions from humankind since the Great Chinese Wall. And we can see the wall by the space right now. Of course, the wall severs the sovereign and ancient. This is a very hard word for me to pronounce, but what I'm trying to say is sever a sovereign ancestral land of the Tohono, the Pascuayaqui, and other sister tribes. Sacred places are blasted. The wall represents a profound spiritual and human rights violation. For the First Nations, water is a living relative, and the wall now actively is disrupted centuries of traditional and ecological governance. Environmental degradation and cultural displacement are deeply intertwined in the borderlands. Nature knows no border. There is an ecological collapse in the groundwater and the environmental flows and gap policies. The biological consequences of this fragmentation are catastrophic. Today, the wild populations that are the stars of this story are extirpated in the Mexico side, and probably the Sonoita pupfish only remains in the wild in Quito Springs. Altered streams, exotic species, persistent water over allocation, plus drought and climate change are desiccating those water bodies. Let me go back here. So the US-Mexico Water Treaty focused only on the major rivers. So there is a legal framework that talks about the water in the border, but they are ignoring the ephemeral desert streams and share aquifers. There is a political and a policy loophole allow unmitigated groundwater pumping for keep growing infrastructure and keep growing agriculture. Environmental flows must to be seen not as a luxury or as or a wasteful remnants of water. They are vital hydrological regimes that keeps the desert biodiversity and ecosystems alive. To save the native freshwater fish species, we cannot simply protect the ponds, but develop and enforce water regulations to actively defend the entire shared transboundary aquifers, ensuring that groundwater guarantee volume, seasonal regimes, and water quality to prevent systematic ecological catastrophes. So what is our backstop strategy? The freshwater in the Sonoita River are facing a total extirpation, but we, the working group, we did not give up. In 26 of the Sonoita Freshwater Fish Working Group with Dr. Alejandro Varela Romero and his 40 years of devoted work in the Northwest Mexico freshwater biodiversity, and other researchers like Doctora Mariana Mateos and her tireless work are proving that we are a community and we do not give up. Law enforcement, like the new Ley General de Aguas, is a water law in Mexico, completely shift the groundwater priority and enforce constitution articles, ensuring that human rights and ecological survival take absolutely precedence over commercial or agricultural concessions, reducing or canceling concessions to safeguard ecological flows and protect critical springs. So we have the laws, now it is time to enforce them. So this is a trilateral collaboration. There are many organizations, both sides of the border. That's why Joseph says that I live both sides of the border. I'm a borderlander, as he is. In US, in Mexico, including local schools, indigenous people, and a lot of people advocating for 26 years that we really need to work together in this broad scope of how to protect nature by protecting ourselves. So what are the things we have to do? So among these frameworks, international environmental agreements, IUCN motions, there are many opportunities to strengthen the policy framework. There are our Endangered Species Act, that it is NOM 059. We have subnational mechanisms to enhance oases and biodiversity protection. So there are things to do. So as we look at the 26 and beyond, our strategy envisions to evolve from the ex situ conservation to a long-term in situ recovery, including other sites and species. So here we are talking about the Sonoita River Basin between Mexico and between Sonora and Arizona. But now we are including other species like the Yaqui catfish or the tongue minnow in other watersheds. This new strategy, the Sonoita longfins and the Sonoita pupfish and the longfin days will be seen not just as an arcs. We keep exploring with the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum how to bring remnants of that populations into the museum to start reproduction and have genetic stock of fish to rewild. But also, and this is a very recent news, we've been talking with the aquarium in Bursa, that it is one of the largest aquarium in Mexico, and it is based in Mexico City with millions of visitors. How can we, in their exhibit of an extinct species, they can use also the species of the Sonoita River Basin. And in that matter, under citizen science, how can we raise awareness about oases? How can we raise awareness about, the conspicuous species of the freshwater ecosystems? So then we will have an ongoing, I guess, successful story. And then we will have enough fish species and fish individuals to rewild those oases. We must use this trinational success story to demand and build border structural policy challenges, while loving to secure biodiversity, species and ecosystems, legal protection mechanisms and enforcement, shifting the geopolitical narrative from border security to border stewardship, securing funds for research, protection, and restoration of this priority site for conservation, reclaiming the borderlands as a collaborative and space of shared culture, vibrant heritage, and life. So let's build bridges, no barriers. Nature has no borders. Nature, as IUCN says, gives us a message. To protect ourselves, we must protect nature. So thank you to Shohal to invite us to talk about a little bit about our desert this morning. Gracias.
Yes, Nelida, that's a lovely sentiment to finish on. Let's build bridges, not borders. I assume there must be so many challenges with taking that sort of bilateral approach to cross-border policy. Is it worth opening that can of worms? What kind of advice do you have for taking the sort of bilateral approach?
In many senses, Mexico and US have a very tight bonds on working together. The bilateral work works. But under the current geopolitical story that we are living, we don't talk about the border, and the border and the impact on water is something that I really feel that becomes invisible. I cross the border wall once a month at least. And I never realized how big it was until I saw this short film named American Scar. Please, if you have the chance, find it in YouTube. It's for free. And then suddenly I realized that, oh my God, all this is happening. And I'm a, full-time conservationist in the area, and I didn't realize about the impact. So imagine politicians that are trying to make their countries function. So it is a big opportunity. And the main message here is do not give up and raise the voice, because it is affecting us. Even when we have amazing binational or trinational collaborative areas, water and the border, it is not one of them.
Thank you so much. I just saw Joseph's comments in the chat. You're welcome to say it, Joseph.
Oh, yeah, sure. I was just saying, Nelida, a good friend of mine who's a Tucson musician just wrote a song inspired by Quito Baquito Spring. And once he gets it recorded, I'll share it with you. I think you'll like it.
Gracias.
That sounds great. I'd love to hear that as well. And from the springs to the mountains, there's no shortage of mountains in Nepal where Sanot is based. And I believe Sanot's gonna speak with us now about mountain springs in crisis, conservation challenges, and policy pathways.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. This is Sanot Adhikari from Nepal, and I have been working in the... Am I audible?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I have been working in the spring sector since 2018, and we have done sorts of work in Nepal and the mountain springs. I am trying to share my... window. Sorry.
Always a scary moment, this.
Sorry.
It's okay. Hopefully it's smooth.
So is something wrong? So, zoom to see your. Okay, just a minute.
I do have a. Oh yeah, it's looking good. It's looking promising. Worst case scenario, I do have a. Oh wow, that's very meta. I do have a
It's
copy of
okay.
Yeah, no, this looks good. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And as John already described about the overarching picture of springs in the global level, and I am now downscaling the issues of springs in the context of mountain regions. My presentations not only showcase the case of the Nepal, it also, I believe that it also reflects the scenarios of the Hindu Kush Himalayan region as well. And my presentations is I focused on the what we have learned on the spring sector since last decade, and what we have achieved, and how can we move forward in the further springs conservation in the mountain regions. Okay. Mountain springs are the lifeline of mountain communities, and of course it's the lifeline of the Nepal's as well, because more than 80% of peoples are directly dependent in the springs who are lives in the hills and mountain regions of Nepal, and which is not only in Nepal, it's also the scenarios, a similar scenario in the Hindu Kush Himalayan regions from Myanmar to Afghanistan, and drying up at an alarming rate of springs in the Nepal and also in entire Hindu Kush Himalayan regions, and more than 90% of the domestic water consumptions are received from the mountain springs. And but in the today's era, the springs are in the crisis due to drying of springs across the mountain, middles and Shivalik regions of Nepal. Perennials flows becoming seasonal, increasing the workload for rural women and others labor force. Agricultural productivity is decreasing, while most of the agricultural sectors depended on the springs water in the context of Nepal and other part of the mountain regions in the Hindu Kush Himalayan regions, and also accelerating the youth migration from the mountain regions to lowland and other part of the world due to the due to the water hardship and decreasing the productivity in the agriculture sectors, and having a limited understanding of springs, understanding about the springs. And why the springs matter for mountain peoples or Nepal? Because peoples are highly dependent on the peoples are dependent for the drink water on the springs, irrigation, livelihood, and economy of the mountain region also dependent on the springs. And also springs provide the ecosystem services, sustaining wetland biodiversity and the springs flows in the region, and springs also serving as the natural buffer against drought and climatic shocks. And also, the springs are not only attached springs are equally attached to the cultural and spiritual value in the regions, and the peoples are deeply rooted in the indigenous knowledge systems that are associated with the springs and culture. Nepal, the physiographical regions of Nepal ranges from the Tarai foothills to the high Himalaya regions, which is also like the highest peak of the world, Mount Everest, high Himalaya. And springs are the most critical in the high and middle mountains, and also into the Shivalik zone at the adjacent part of the Tarai regions, where the majority of the populations are occupied in that regions. And sorry. in youth alliance for environment has done some sorts of work in the western part of Nepal that we in that our research we found that 70% of springs have decreasing its discharge in the last 20 years, and we published the journal articles related that research, a few so 6-7 articles related that research and and other yeah, and in the other regions of Hindu Kush Himalayan regions also show the similar types of scenario over the regions from Myanmar to Afghanistan. But in the region, there is a very limited research has been conducted so far on the springs. Sorry. Youth Alliance for Environment, we invented and mapped over the 12,000 of springs in the different watershed of western part of Nepal, and we noticed that the shortage of drinking water and other domestic purposes and increasing the hardship to the local communities on the to meet the water demanding in the regions and suffering the challenges to sustain their day-to-day life due to the drying of springs, because local communities in the rural village are highly dependent on the spring sources for their to sustain to fulfill their domestic and the agricultural demand. As there are some factors that affecting the drying of springs in the regions. The first and very important factors are climate change, which is changing the precipitation patterns in the regions. In the short duration, high intensity of rainfall increases the surface runoff and reduce the infiltrations and groundwater recharge. Longer dry periods affect the perennials and seasonal spring flow. Also, the traditional water bodies has been vanishing ponds, aloe well, and the other small water bodies, which are highly highly supporting for the annual groundwater recharge, which are highly vanishing in the context of Nepal and other Hindu Kush Himalayan regions. So that the recharge of aquifer is decreasing, and also reduce the local water recharge and base flow support also decrease due to the vanishing of traditional water bodies. And the topography and hydrogeology also affect the drying of springs. In the very slopy land in the mountain regions, the high intensity of precipitation in this very short period, the accumulation of the runoff is very faster, and the surface runoff is highly enhanced, and the lower the infiltration, and which very hard to retain the water in the land surface, so which can limited the aquifer recharge in those regions. And also, one of the major factors that affecting the drying of springs in the region is that unsustainable infrastructures, not only in the context of Nepal, it also the similar case in the LDCs and the Hindu Kush Himalayan regions. Infrastructure basically on linear infrastructures without the adequate safeguarding of environmental issues. So the affecting the percolation route and the damaging the infiltration route of the groundwater, which can also accelerate the accumulation of the runoff water in the regions, and accelerate the runoff during the rainy seasons, and which may decrease the aquifer recharge. Also, trapping the springs and water diversion from the source, direct tapping of the springs into the tanks and other pipes. The pipe also reducing the aquifer recharge in the downstream of for the other downstream springs. In the past, the most of the water is what spring sources are in the natural conditions, and they are continuously recharge the downstream aquifer, and which support for the regular recharge the downstream springs and providing the supply. But in the in the from the last few decades, the spring sources are tapping from the source and reducing the recharge phenomena by diverting the waters. Um, and there are some impacts of springs declines in the regions, which also affect on the hydrological impacts, land use drivers, and socioeconomic impacts and ecosystem impacts. There are other under the socioeconomic impact. It's also the impact on the overall mountain economy in the regions, because the energy mountain springs also supply for the energy and agricultural supports, and which is the major source of economy in the regions, which is also affecting by the decreasing the discharge of the springs, not only in the domestic purpose. It's also the affecting the overall life system in the regions, including the biodiversity loss. In the context of Nepal, major rivers, there are 4 river systems. So Karnali, Kosi, Gandaki, and Mahakali are the snow-fed rivers, which is originate from the higher Himalayan range, and other most of the river systems are originate from the mid hills and the lower part of the Nepal, which are 100% fed by the springs. While drying of the springs, the may reduce the discharge of that particular river systems, which is originated from the spring fed. So in the and the biodiversity of that river systems, for different types of fishes are also the declining in the river systems, and the agricultural productivity are also greatly reduced. To conserve the springs in the mountain regions, we have to understand the spring set approach, and we have to because the spring set is the local unit that need to work for the conservation of the springs in the region. Without protecting the spring set, we cannot protect the springs and recharge the aquifer. For the proper management of the springs, we have to start the step on the spring set management approach for that comprehensive mapping of the springs and spring sets. And during the comprehensive mapping, we can get a number of springs, and which springs is the most critical stage, and how it providing the services to the local communities and the ecosystem, and so we can get the information on this way. And also need to set up the data for the regular monitoring of the system, and understand the social and governance aspect of the communities and how they are managing the springs in their territorial, and also need to conduct the hydrogeological mapping and to understand how this spring has been formed, and how can we enhance the recharge phenomena in this particular spring sets. And also need to develop the conceptual hydrological models to perform the work in the local levels, and classify the spring types, and identify recharge potential recharge zone, and develop and implement the spring sets management protocols, and measures the hydrological and social impact. And all this aspect has to be continuously need to do, and obviously in the other part of the regions. By applying this spring set management approach, we can use the nature-based solution for the spring revival in the regions. We have done some sorts of work in the context of Nepal, and also these types of work have been starting in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region in the regions. Uh, uh, in the context of springs, I want to enter into some policy landscape in the context of Nepal. The National Adaptation Plan, which is the major document for the climate change adaptations in the Nepal, which is the developed for the mid-term and long-term till 2050. In that document, springs identified as the one of the priority adaptation measures provide the framework to the local adaptation planning processes. As in the climate change policy in 2019, the 19 mandates the ecosystem-based adaptations and open the space for springs specific intervention in the climate change within the climate finance. In the nationally determined contribution which has been submitted by government of Nepal in last June, and we are in last June, and in Youth Alliance for Environment and myself was involved during the preparation of the nationally determined contribution 3.0, and we are incorporate spring sources explicitly in the investment area for the protection and restoration in to combat the to combat the water security in the middle of Nepal. And similarly, local government Act 2017 also empowered the local government for the mandate for the water supply, conservation, and natural resource management, which is also the which is not explicitly mentioned the spring sources conservation and related activities, but the spring sources activities fall under that act. That act for the local government, and also Forest Act 2029 in Nepal identified some potential recharge zone, but exclusively spring set provisions are very weak in that act, and revised LAPA framework also integrate the spring set management approach in the municipal level in the context of Nepal. But we have some institutional challenges in the challenges in Nepal, because the fragmented mandates have been mandated in the context of Nepal for the springs. Not particularly institutions are taking the roles and responsibility for the springs conservation and restorations. Ministry of Water Supply and Sanitation, Ministry of Forest and Environment, Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Developments, and other local government units are associated with the spring source conservation and the management, but no single entity are taking their own responsibility and taking a lead role in the spring shared management and the governance issues. And intergovernmental agencies have a very minimal coordination, and which create the problems for the effectively implementation of spring source protection and restoration activities in the context of Nepal. Also, another limitations is financing. Springs are the very neglected issues since last decade, but when the Youth Alliance for Environment started one large scale research projects on springs in 2018, that our research has changed some narratives in the context of Nepal, and we shared out series wise shared our research outcomes to the policy makers, and after that this issue has been started to incorporate in the policy document in the context of Nepal, due to and we are also engaging in the policy formulation process in the climate change and environmental issues, so that these issues are gradually entering into the policy process in Nepal. Another is challenges is the capacity gap. Local government has a rights to conserve the water resources in their territory, and but they have a limited knowledge with their institutional capacity, and the lack of hydrogeological expertise and data tools and the trained personnel in the local government, so that they have very limited knowledge on the spring set management and the water springs restoration. Sorry. Similarly, we have some knowledge gap as well in the spring source management in the context of Nepal, and this is also seen similar scenario in the Hindu Himalayan region as well. No national inventory system till now in the context of Nepal, and similar situation in the Hindu Himalayan region. We are also sometimes gathered in the regions and discuss about the potential similar action in the region. So we face similar types of situation in the region. Insufficient hydrogeological data, aquifer mapping, restrictions, delineation, and groundwater flow characterizations are absent in the most of the hilly region and watershed of the watershed, and no long-term flow monitoring system in the context of Nepal and over the Hindu Himalayan regions, and we are not associating the socio-economic linkage with the springs while we are doing the research on the springs, because socio-economic context is the very crucial to the springs, and the local livelihood also indirectly and directly associate with the people. So we have to engage the socio-economic aspect with the springs research, and springs climate springs flow correlations also we have very limited knowledge, and we do not have a database. So as a quantitative model linkage with the rainfall variability and the temperature trend to specific the springs discharge are rare for the Nepalese context, in the Nepalese complex geology. So we have to enhance the knowledge on this area in the days to come. Based on my knowledge and my working experience, I have outlined some policy pathways for the spring source conservation in the regions, basically on the context of Nepal, which is also similar in the Hindu Himalayan regions. A national inventory system we have to need to develop for the which include the geo-reference all spring across the hills and mountain districts or watershed in the region. Standardized flow measurement protocols for the community need to be operationalized and integrate the springs data into the national water information systems. Similarly, spring state local planning process is the another area to work in the futures, and need to mandate the spring search assessment in the all municipal plans, design the recharge zone and as a protected land use category, and better to align the local planning and assessment with the springs protection protocols. Springs integrations on the climate change adaptation is another crucial issues, because in the context of Nepal and other LDCs, including Hindu Himalayan regions, climate change are majorly impact on the water resource and agricultures, and the springs are the very critical or sensitive to the climatic variables, so that we have to integrate the springs conservations and restoration activities to the climate change adaptation project in the regions. So it would be good to allocate around 20% of the climate finance to the spring related or to secure the water security in the regions, and need to integrate the NAP and LAPA. The government of Nepal is under the process to review the NAP, National Adaptation Plan of Action, and the local adaptation plan framework in the process. So we are trying to integrate these things in this policy document in days to come. Sorry. And also mobilizing the climate finance is another very important issues for the conservation of the springs and to secure the water security in the regions. And it would be good to operationalize the payment for ecosystem schemes in the context of mountain regions. The highland, highland to lowland interaction would be the good scope for the payment for ecosystem services. And community engagement and increasing the community governance is also another important issues for the conservation of the springs in the days to come. and the government of Nepal, along with these regions, need to be prioritized on the data management system restoration program by scaling up the nature-based solutions solution. By the available resources, the technologies, and also need to the capacity building for the government, local communities, local government, and other local citizen scientists on the different aspect of the to work on the different aspect of the springs conservations, and we have to finance on the applied research for the springs related research, finance climate springs discharge modeling, isotope analysis, and socio-economic impact studies to be built on the evidence-based evidence for the better to conduct the better outcomes on the springs restoration in the regions, and need to scale the scaling the pilot projects in the successful pilot project in the other part of the regions or nation, in the various watersheds of the new geographic area. Based on my experience in the context of Nepal, I can outline some strategic recommendation for the spring source protections in the short term, mid term, and long term phased approach, which institutionalizing the springs conservation across the Nepal's planning and governance systems for short term 1 to 2 years, for medium term to 2 to 3 years, and for long term 5 to 10 years. For short term, we have to start the immediate national spring inventory pilot in the let's say certain districts or certain watershed, and develop the standard of the spring set assessment protocols and formalize this through the government process, and integrate springs into the NAP or LAPA frameworks, and launch the multi-stakeholder coordination platform for the spring source protections as a conservations. For the medium term, springs scale the spring set management in certain watershed, establish the dedicated springs conservation fund, and we can train the number of local technician or community monitors to to measure the discharge and other associate attributes of the springs in the regions for their by utilizing the local peoples, and launching the gender transformative it would be good to we can do with the gender transformative springs governance program for the to build the ownership of the community and all the stakeholders in the community for the spring source conservations. And for the long term, nationally registry need to be developed, and good to have a real-time monitoring of the system. Many the springs indicator in the water security policy. Climate resilience spring systems in mountain regions need to be developed, and regional knowledge exchange platform in the Hindu-Himalayan region or north-south collaboration would be better or better. I can also my proposal is that it would be good to form the Global Springs Alliance or Global Springs Network for the to foster the activities on the springs in days to come, so that we can globally this group can be form the Global Springs Alliance or task force for, to work on the springs globally, and we can globally jointly explore the financial and the technical know-how to protect the springs in the days to come. And the last point is that the last slide is that the path forward for the springs conservation in the region is the map and understand every single spring set, protect the recharge zone through the law and community ownership, and restore the degraded springs with the nature-based solution at scales, and financing springs conservation through the climate adaptation funds. We are developing the various types of climate funds, but without securing the water, without the water security, the climate adaptation activities would not be sustained. So we have to link with the climate change adaptation with the springs source protections or restorations in the region. And the women and marginalized people are the most vulnerable people by drying up the sources. So we have to integrate the women and marginalized group in the spring source protections and the conservation issues. Protecting of the springs is not the today's flow. It's the good. It's this is the food for the tomorrows. So we have to work on that jointly. Thank you.
Sanot, thank you so much. There was so much information there. You really crammed it in. It was fantastic. And you mentioned that in one of the priorities in the short term in Nepal is to develop this national springs inventory. If I understood correctly, in the first session, season on spring session, Larry Stevens, the current director of Spring Stewardship Institute, mentioned the same thing for the States. I think, is that right, Joseph? That there's thousands of unmapped springs in the US, which if
actually hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. Wow.
Wow.
Which really,
yeah.
What's going on here, buddy?
Yeah. In Nepal, in the context of Nepal, Youth Alliance for Environment mapped around 12,000 of springs, and ICMOD, based on our research methodology, ICMOD using that one and mapping in the center part of Nepal around 6,000 to 7,000 of the springs, I think. So altogether around 16,000, 17,000 springs has been monitored and map out.
Yeah, brilliant.
So,
thank you. Sorry, Sanot, do you mind? I think you're sharing your screen, which is giving this slightly disconcerting on Valley.
Sorry.
No, thank you. That's great. It just sort of highlights how overlooked springs are, doesn't it? If there's sort of hundreds of thousands of springs in the US alone that have been unmapped, it really sort of shows how on a policy level they have just been chronically neglected. We need to push on just for time. Sanot, thank you so much. We'll circle back at the end with some questions. But yeah, Joseph, are you ready to bring your presentation up?
Yep. You guys can all see that, I assume? Cool. Well, I see a bunch of familiar names in the audience, some new names. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks Michael and Mike and the rest of the Shoal team for organizing. And thanks to Sanot, John, and Nelida, the four of us, as well as the other panelists from the two previous sessions. We're all telling pieces of the same global story. Sanot's work focuses on mountain springs in crisis in Nepal, where some of the most water-stressed communities on Earth depend on springs for drinking water, and where many of those springs are drying. John's making the case for why springs deserve a permanent place on policy agendas, and Nelida has shown what biocultural conservation looks like across borders in her work in the Sonoran Desert. These contributions are necessary, but they alone are not sufficient, because what each of them illuminates in a different way is the same underlying truth. Springs are simultaneously among the most foundational ecosystems on Earth and among the most invisible to global systems that exist to protect fresh water. Every continent has its own version of the spring crisis. Every region has practitioners doing extraordinary work, but globally we are still operating in fragments. The question my talk tries to answer is this: what does it take to turn fragments into coordinated action? What is the global architecture that scales the regional realities, the policy arguments, and the collaborative models we have just heard into an international response that matches the magnitude of what we are losing? The short answer is, I hope, the IUCN Global Springs Task Force. And the larger answer is what I want to spend the next 15 minutes or so describing: where the task force came from, what it is, why its structure matters, what it commits us to do over the coming years, and how each of you in this audience can be a part of it. I want to be honest that this is still a story being written. The task force proposal has been submitted to 3 IUCN commissions, and we're awaiting their formal response. So you're hearing about this initiative as it's forming in real time, with the participation of many of the people in this call, the opportunity to shape it, to participate in it, and to put your work in your region inside its scope is genuinely open. I'm co-chairing this effort along with Dr. Heidi van Deventer of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. Heidi and I are based on different continents for a reason. From the very beginning, this task force has been built around the conviction that the springs crisis is a global crisis and that the response has to be global too. So let me start where the task force itself starts, with the problem of coordination. The freshwater conservation community is good at many things. We've built international scientific networks. We've produced major synthesis reports. We've developed legal and policy instruments, Ramsar, Red List of Species Ecosystems, Key Biodiversity Areas, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Collectively, these define how freshwater ecosystems are recognized and protected globally. Springs, however, sit almost entirely outside those instruments. Springs are rarely mapped at national scale, as we just talked about, let alone globally. They are inconsistently defined across regions and disciplines. The IUCN Red List of Ecosystems does not yet treat springs as a distinct ecosystem type. Key biodiversity areas occasionally include springs when they happen to contain notable species, but the springs themselves are not the unit of recognition. Ramsar protects wetlands, including some spring-fed wetlands, but the spring as a discrete ecosystem rarely qualifies on its own. The global ecosystem typology has only recently begun to address the question of where springs sit within the broader typology of freshwater systems. The result is structural invisibility. Springs fall between disciplines, between groundwater and surface water, between hydrology and ecology, between protected area frameworks and species programs. Most countries have never mapped springs. Most freshwater funders have never funded springs. And most policy frameworks have never named springs. That is the kind of fragmentation. This is the first fragmentation I'm going to talk about, and that is institutional. Springs do not have a global home. The second kind of fragmentation is scientific. There are extraordinary research groups working on springs in many parts of the world. Heidi and her colleagues at CSIR are doing landscape scale work in South Africa. The Spring Stewardship Institute, where I work, holds the largest springs ecosystem database in existence. And then all of the other folks on this call's organizations, from John, Nelida, and Sanot. These are research groups working. There's also research groups working on karst springs in the Mediterranean, artesian springs in Australia, montane springs across the Himalayas, and cienagas across the Southwest, and many more. But the methods across these various efforts do not align. The data sit in silos. Definitions vary. The next person who wants to ask, how do springs of region X compare to springs of region Y, run into the wall of incommensurable data sets. The third kind of fragmentation is community. Indigenous nations, ranchers, hydrologists, policy advocates, microbiologists, restoration practitioners, freshwater funders, IUCN specialists. All of these communities have a stake in springs and a contribution to make. They mostly do not yet know each other, however, and they mostly do not yet have a forum to meet in. So when we ask, what is the global architecture for spring conservation? The honest answer today is that it does not yet exist. The task force, however, is the move towards building it. So let's talk about the task force. It did not appear out of nowhere. It is the operational answer to a commitment the global conservation community made very recently. In October 2025 at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Abu Dhabi, IUCN members passed Resolution 16 titled Springs Under Threat, Mobilizing Urgent Action for Neglected Freshwater Systems. The resolution was the culmination of years of work by people in this audience and by colleagues around the world. It is, to my knowledge, the first time the global conservation community has formally recognized springs as an urgent and underrepresented freshwater priority. Resolution 16 commits IUCN, its member states, and its commissions to a set of actions, improving the recognition of springs in conservation frameworks, advancing standardized inventory and assessment methods, integrating springs into national and international policy, and strengthening the science and stewardship of spring ecosystems. A resolution on its own, however, is a statement of intent only. It carries moral and political weight inside IUCN, and it can be cited at the international level as a recognized commitment. But a resolution is not an institutional structure. It is not staff. It is not a work plan. It is not a forum where the world's spring specialists meet and produce shared outputs. That is what the task force is for. The task force takes the commitment embedded in Resolution 16 and gives it institutional form. It is the vehicle through which the resolution gets implemented across the IUCN community. This matters because IUCN is, in many ways, the global infrastructure for conservation. It is where states, NGOs, scientists, and indigenous nations all gather under one roof. If we want springs to be visible at the global scale, The IUCN architecture is where that visibility is built. I want to now turn a little bit and describe exactly what we are proposing. The IUCN Intercommission Task Force on Springs is structurally a coordinating body that sits across 3 of IUCN's 6 standing commissions: the World Commission on Protected Areas, the Species Survival Commission, and the Commission on Ecosystem Management. The intercommission structure is deliberate, and I'm going to talk about why. It's co-chaired by myself, representing the Spring Stewardship Institute in the United States, and Dr. Heidi van Deventer of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. Our core team includes scientists, practitioners, hydrogeologists, indigenous knowledge holders, and policy specialists from every continent where springs occur. Geographic and disciplinary diversity was a design principle, not an afterthought. The task force operates on a 4-year timeline aligned with the IUCN quadrennium, meaning our work cycles will coincide with the major IUCN reporting and planning cycles. That alignment is what allows the task force output to be brought directly into IUCN's institutional processes. The task force commits to 6 core goals. First, we will define, classify, and map springs globally. This is the foundational science the rest of our work will depend on. You cannot protect what you have not defined, and you cannot prioritize what you have not mapped. The goal directly supports Target 1 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Secondly, we will identify and prioritize the spring ecosystems most critical to biodiversity conservation: hydrologic integrity and cultural heritage. Not every spring can receive equal attention. Triage in this case matters. The task force will develop the framework that allows the global conservation community to direct resources where they will do the most good. And third, we will work together to integrate springs into the major global conservation frameworks. That means the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems, key biodiversity areas, Ramsar sites, the Kunming-Montreal GBF Target 3, World Heritage nominations, and the global ecosystem typology. This is the policy architecture work. It is slow, technical, and unglamorous. It is also the work that determines whether springs are recognized in the systems that actually shape national and international conservation decisions. And fourth, we will strengthen data accessibility and interpretability through a centralized global springs database linked to IUCN platforms. The Springs research community has data scattered across hundreds of institutions in dozens of formats, often inaccessible to anyone outside the research group that produced it. The task force will work to standardize, integrate, and make this data accessible to scientists, managers, and decision makers who need it. Fifth, we will develop policy guidance and management best practices for springs within protected areas. Other effective area-based conservation measures and working landscapes. This is where the science meets the ground. We will produce the technical guides, the protocols, and the management frameworks that practitioners can actually use. And sixth, we will advance awareness and capacity building among scientists, policymakers, and indigenous and local communities. The springs crisis is, in significant part, a visibility crisis. The task force will work to make springs visible at every level of the conservation conversation, from local stewardship to global policy. These 6 goals are not a wish list. They are mapped against a year-by-year work plan. Year 1 focuses on foundational framework development and the assembly of the expert network. Year 2 on data compilation, the beta version of a global springs database, and initial red list assessments. Year 3 on prioritization, policy integration, and stakeholder engagement. Year 4 on conservation action plans, the publication of a global springs management handbook, and the formal handoff of outputs into IUCN's institutional processes for the following quadrennium. In other words, this is not a conference, it's not a network, it's not a one-off initiative. It is a 4-year coordinated work program with measurable deliverables and clear lines of accountability to IUCN itself. Let me spend a moment on the intercommission structure because I think it's one of the most strategically important choices we've made with the task force. IUCN has 6 standing commissions. 3 of them are directly relevant to springs. The World Commission on Protected Areas is the global body that develops standards and frameworks for protected areas, OECMs, and area-based conservation. If we want springs to be recognized in protected area designation, in Ramsar applications, and in KBA assessments, that is the WCPA conversation. The Species Survival Commission is the global body that conducts the IUCN Red List assessment and develops species conservation strategies. If we want springs-dependent species, the endemic invertebrates, the fish, the amphibians, and the plants that we've heard about in these sessions that exist nowhere else on Earth except for a few springs at times, to be visible on global red list processes. That is the SSC conversation. And the third one, the Commission on Ecosystem Management. It's the global body that develops ecosystem level frameworks, including the global ecosystem typology and the red listed ecosystems. If we want springs to be recognized as a distinct ecosystem type globally, that is the CEM conversation. For decades, springs work has had to navigate through whichever of these conversations the local researchers happen to have access to. The result has been partial. Some springs work has happened on the species side, some on the protected area side, but almost none at the ecosystem typology level. No one has been responsible for stitching it together yet. The Intercommission Task Force is the institutional structure that finally takes responsibility for the whole. We will work simultaneously across WCPA, SSC, and CEM, coordinating with the relevant specialist groups in each: Freshwater Conservation Committee, Freshwater Fish Specialist Group, Mollusk Specialist Group, the Wetlands Specialist Group, the Dryland Specialist Group, Mountain Ecosystem Specialist Group, and many, many more. This is the kind of structure that allows a coherent global story about springs to be told to IUCN and the broader public. It is also the kind of structure that allows IUCN responses to be coherent across its own programs. If the intercommission framework sounds bureaucratic, I would offer this: good bureaucracy is what scales. Not all bureaucracy, of course. The climate framework has produced disappointing outcomes in part because it was designed poorly. But the kind of bureaucracy that is lean, accountable, and aimed at concrete deliverables is the only thing that consistently coordinates many actors across geographies, generations, and disciplines. The clearest proof we have is the Montreal Protocol, which phased out ozone-depleting substances through exactly this kind of coordinated international architecture, and is now widely regarded as the most successful global environmental agreement in history. The ozone layer, after all, is recovering because nation scientists and industry built the architecture to make it recover. The assessment panels that produced the science, the funds that financed the substitutes, the meetings that bound the parties. The architecture is the reason that it worked. Springs do not have anything like that today. Every researcher, every region, every institution is reinventing the same wheel in isolation. The task force is the first step towards building the minimum institutional structure that lets all of that work add up. Not bureaucracy for its own sake, but the lean architecture that turns scattered effort into coordinated action. Let me close where I started, with the work Sanot, John, and Nelida are bringing. Sanot's Mountain Springs in Crisis, John's policy case, and Nelida's biocultural Sonoran collaboration are not three separate problems with three separate solutions. They are three windows onto the same global story. The task force exists so that the next time we host a webinar like this one, we are not just hearing case studies and policy arguments. We are hearing about a global database that connects Sanot springs in Nepal to springs across the Himalayas, to springs across the world. We are hearing about red list assessments that protect springs-dependent species across the continents. We are hearing about policy guidance that practitioners in the Sonoran Desert and in the Andes and the Mediterranean are all able to draw on. The world does not yet exist. It is the world, however, that we are trying to build with the task force. So my closing ask of this audience is direct. If you work on springs in any capacity, anywhere in the world, we want to know about you and your work. The task force is being designed to be inclusive, geographically and disciplinarily, and we have explicit room for new members, new partner institutions, and new regional working groups. The proposal has been submitted to the three commissions, and we're now in the formation phase, which is the moment when participation has the most influence on what gets built. If you want springs to stop being the most overlooked freshwater ecosystem on Earth, the task force is the structure through which that happens. Please reach out. Please get involved. Please bring your region and your work into the conversation. There's one more thing worth saying about why coordinated springs conservation is possible in a way that some other freshwater work is not, and why the task force is the architecture that makes it possible. Springs operate at a scale where individual action genuinely matters. It is nearly impossible for one person to transform a great river, but one person can fundamentally change the fate of a single spring. That is true everywhere that springs occur, and it is also the reason coordination matters so much. Uncoordinated individual action saves one spring at a time, where the individual happens to be. Coordinated, however, through a global structure, that same individual capacity becomes the foundation of a worldwide movement for springs. This is what the task force is for, not just a coordinating body, but the architecture that connects what one person does at one spring to what is happening at springs across the world. If we can convince 1,000 people that one spring matters, then we can save thousands of springs. Connect those thousands of people through a global framework, and we save the foundation of freshwater life. And because springs feed the base flow of nearly every river on Earth, to care for our springs is to care for almost all freshwater life on the planet. The task force is how we can get the world to start paying attention. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joseph. To care for springs is to care for almost all fresh water on the planet. That's brilliant. I think a lot of the attendees are based in North America at the moment, but if anybody's based in Western Europe, they'll be very aware that there's a heat wave at the moment, and seeing these photos of what look like pristine springs is its own special form of torture when we're sweltering in sort of 37 degrees C, which I think is about 90, 96, 97 Fahrenheit. But thank you for that. That was fascinating. And you mentioned this task force that is in its formation phase at the moment, and that there's still room for new members, partner institutions, and regional working groups. For people who might be in this audience who may wish to engage, what's the most concrete way for them to do that right now?
Yeah, I'd say just get in contact, email me or Heidi or really anyone from Spring Stewardship Institute. As Michael said, it's very much in the formation stage, so we're actively trying to bring more people into the Springs Task Force who are interested in becoming a part of it. So I'd say just reach out. I'll drop my email in the chat. And we're hoping to kind of get this thing really off the ground and running in the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, fantastic. So if there is anyone listening to this who wants to get involved, please do reach out to Joseph. Has anybody in the audience got any questions? I haven't seen anything come through in the chat. I have another couple of questions here that I'd love to ask. John has been turfed out of the university department that he was that he was in. He's in the Stellenbosch University at the moment, and he no longer has an access pass. So John had to leave, I'm afraid. But if anybody has a question for John, we can forward it to John. Or if anybody has any other questions for any of the other panelists, please do put them in the chat. Nelida is asking, you can ask it out loud. You can interrupt me. Feel free to jump in.
No. I was just wondering if this, conception and creation of the task force, it is related to the recent invitation we received from Showlee to a meeting on October in Nevada. So what will be, the processes to join to the task force?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the meeting you received from Truly, it is absolutely related. And so what I didn't talk about is there's another side of this, which is the Global Springs Alliance, and that meeting is really to kind of understand how these two kind of different efforts are going to act harmoniously with one another. And so it is absolutely related. And the Global Springs Alliance, again, that's also in its formation, and we're thinking through it, but that's going to be, I think, much more on the funding side. So it's how can we be really creative and generate funding so that we can fund some of these bigger initiatives that are kind of a part of this task force, like I've outlined. I think I've outlined quite an ambitious goal, and to have that come to fruition, there's going to have to be significant funds, and the Global Springs Alliance, I think, is kind of the complement to that. And we're still teasing apart exactly which roles each of those two kind of groups play. But the October meeting, like you're describing, is definitely related to the task force.
Gracias. And just to highlight that I really like the way that you make your presentation, was unusual, like seeing images of the springs and the freshwater ecosystems, and then hearing your speech. It was a way of connecting both sides, as an IUCN member, and thinking that, nature for all, and you don't protect what you don't know, then watching those images make us rethink about what do you think or understand as a spring. Thank you, Joseph, for that.
Oh yeah, thanks, Nelida.
As a comms person, I love it when people's presentations just have photos and no text on the screen, just pictures. That always makes me very happy, especially when they're beautiful pictures. Larry Stevens has asked a brilliant question. The presenters have described freshwater springs. What about marine springs? It's a bit of a curveball for Shoal being a freshwater focused organization, but we can't neglect marine springs and a season on springs.
Yeah, I don't know. Who does anyone want to take that one, or should I take that one? Yeah, I mean, marine springs are obviously an incredibly important part of the larger springs dialogue. I think we've thus far kind of chosen to focus on freshwater springs because we got to start somewhere. I think the goal is that ultimately we will get to marine springs. Part of the limitation is we really don't know, or at least I don't know anyone working on marine springs. So if folks have contacts working on marine springs, we'd love to include it, but that's largely been neglected on our end simply because we don't really have a lot of information on it yet.
Yeah, if there are hundreds of thousands of unmapped springs in the US alone, I cannot imagine how many unmapped springs there are in the ocean.
Yeah, one of the message we always share with our audiences and talks is like we know more about the surface of the moon in regards the deep ocean. So that question was like, oh my God, we really don't know anything about that. So it will be a huge, incredible challenge to answer that, Larry. Sorry about it.
I have a hunch, being the current director of the Spring Stewardship Institute, I have a hunch that Larry knew the answer to that question, but it's good that he asked it. Rennie Thomas says there are some folks in southern India that are working on freshwater spring discharges in the sea. Don't remember the institute at this point. Okay, Rennie, yeah, thank you for letting us know. If you do remember it, please do message in. It would be good to get in touch with them and learn. So I guess we have a very small amount of time before we have to wrap before the hour. But Sanot, I have a question for you. A couple of questions actually. What could be the sort of potential urgent actions that can save mountain springs?
Thank you, Michael. Basically, for the conservation of mountain, springs, first we have to understand about the springs. Basically, till now we have very much limited knowledge on the for the academic level too. We have very much limited knowledge about the springs. So we have very much limited research conducted so far in the context of springs in the mountain regions. Every springs have their own specific characteristics and their own hydrology. So the springs is so much time taking, and have their different types of the types and their own characteristics. So we have to generate the knowledge first, for the to understand the nature and the patterns and their attributes of the springs first. After that, till now the springs is neglected issues in the region, not only in Nepal, over the Indus Himalayan regions, but the springs are the major source of drinking water, around 2 billions in the which is serving the 2 billions in the downstream of the mountain Indus Himalayan regions. So we have to give the prioritize for the springs for the conservation because due to the climate climate change, the springs has getting serious, threat for the, serious threat. So we have to give a priority on the spring source protection and the conservation and the restorations in the regions. And along with, we have to inbuild the springs into the government planning process and other policy documents in each country and each, province or each local government, to shape the springs and start to act locally with from the own communities and own, settlement and own local government, to manage the springs, very diverse way. So we have to internalize the springs, internalize its importance, and internalize the values of the springs in the economy of the, every community. So in this way, we have to sensitize the community and the nation and the region for the springs protections. And after that, series wise activities have to be done in the short term, mid term, and long term way for the conservation of the springs. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Larry says Stephanie von Fumetti's work, who was on the very first season on spring session back in April, her work on the Alps springs might be relevant to improving understanding Himalayan springs. So, Sanot, I'm not sure if you're in touch with Stephanie, but if not, I can send you guys an introduction if you'd like. Okay, so
thank you.
Okay, great. I'll follow up with that. Yeah, that's actually all we have time for, unless we might be able to squeeze in one very final quick question, but I'm not sure there are any. But I think that's all we have time for. Thanks so much to each of you, Sanot, Nelida, Joseph. It was really fascinating whistle stop tour. It's such a broad topic, isn't it? I've learned so much about it over the last 3 months since we started doing this season. And Joseph, speaking with Joseph and Larry and the other panelists who have been on as well, have really sort of opened my eyes to how complex they are and how critically urgent their conservation needs are. Covered a lot of ground through this season, from the hyperlocal Devil's Hole in Death Valley and the subterranean karst system of India's Western Ghats, through to the global understanding of why springs are so important to freshwater ecosystems and biodiversity. And we've been learning about their myriad threats and, of course, the research and policy that we've just learned about in place to help safeguard their future. If anybody does have any further questions that you didn't manage to ask in the session, please email info@shoalconservation.org and I will forward them to the panelists and get back to you very soon. And we will have the recording on YouTube before the weekend, so please do point people to Shoal's channel if you feel they'd be interested in this conversation. We're going to take a break from webinars for a couple of months, but we're planning some sessions from late August, so please do keep an eye on our socials and our newsletter to stay in the loop about those. And that's it for now. Thank you again to the panelists. Thank you guys for joining us, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Joseph, and everyone for taking this, in this session.
Gracias.
Thank
For
you.
sure.
Gracias. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
See ya. Bye-bye. See you.